What are some of the differences you find between verbal storytelling and pen and paper storytelling?
Great question, Luke. Comma. One, I think written stuff in some ways is scarier for me. Though I love it more, I think it's scarier in that people tend to judge written things way more harshly. Because like even now, when we're conversing, people kind of give you a bandwidth of grace because they know that you might say something you didn't mean. But when it's printed, we go, no, they chose that word. That is what they meant. And so we get held hostage to what's on paper, I think, more strictly than we do when it's spoken. And so I think that's a very big difference from a creation standpoint. I try to then steward my words on paper very, very, very carefully. The other, or amongst others, another difference is that when I'm communicating here, words are only doing part of the communicating, right? It's like I'm communicating a percentage with my eyes, with my hands, with my tone, with my emotion, with my tears, with my tenor, all these different things. When you're writing, you are stripped of all that, and you have one friend, and it's just little images that we know to form sounds by which we interpret meaning. And so I'm amazed at how sometimes there are things I can communicate verbally that I don't know how to communicate on paper, and it's because I can't use this or these other things to help me. And so, but that's part of the challenge that I love. You know, it's like, it's just me, like about the writing, I mean, it's just me and printed words. And how do we encapsulate and capture all the emotion and essence that could be communicated verbally when all we have is a keyboard and paper?
I walked in a little late, so hopefully you haven't touched on this yet, but when/how did you start writing?
What was your name?
Sarah, sorry.
Good morning, Sarah. So I wrote a lot as a kid. For me, writing was a refuge from some of my familial dysfunction. I mentioned, that my dad had his own addiction. My family, has anyone ever seen the show Hoarders on like AMC or A&E or E&I or whatever the letter ones are? That was my family. And so I struggled with how to deal with that. And so one of the ways I coped was I would just go in my room and I would read and I would write. And when I was doing that, like a lot of that stuff that otherwise felt oppressive was just a little more distant. So I wrote a lot as a kid. The first story I ever wrote was a comic strip called Marvelous Marvin. And if ever you've read Calvin and Hobbes, he has this alter ego named Spaceman Spiff. And this was just a complete ripoff. I mean, if ever it had been published, I would have been sued for plagiarism in a heartbeat. I mean, he basically looked the exact same. He had this little blue suit on with a yellow lightning bolt. The only difference was I used M alliteration, Marvelous Marvin, instead of S alliteration, Spaceman Spiff. But I loved doing it. And so I even drew out all the panels, and I loved it so much, I actually sewed a doll. I sewed this Marvelous Marvin doll, which I then sold to my mom for, I think, $2.50. But so I wrote a lot as a kid. But then as I kind of got into high school, in the era when I grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago, this was like pre-hipster revolution when art was cool. And so back then it's like now unless you're an athlete, like, you're kind of marginalized a little bit. And me, I think, wanting to be in whatever crowd I wanted to be in and being too insecure in my own right, I kind of forsook all of the writing pursuits and really didn't do it for years until after college, other than required writing and stuff like that. Out of college, I was actually a pastor for 5 years. both in the Chicagoland area and then in Austin, Texas. And I enjoyed it for a while. I certainly learned a lot, grew a lot. But as I was kind of reacquainted with that boy in me that I still was, it became apparent that I needed to pursue writing. And so it was almost 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years ago this coming May. I was sitting in my office. I remember it very vividly. I was playing solitaire, which was an indication to me that I was not where I should be. And so I asked myself like a very, very basic question, and it was, career-wise, if I could do anything with my life, what would I do? And I hadn't asked that question in a long time, and I want to make a distinction here. I had asked the question, if I could do anything with my life, what would I do? But I wasn't really asking it. What I was saying was, if I could do anything within this box, what would I do? Because it's got to provide health insurance, and it's got to be steady, and my parents got to be proud, and whatever. And so I think I'd made decisions operating out of this confining paradigm to begin with. But this time in my office, I was like, okay, forget that. If I could really do anything, what would I do? And truth be told, if I could do anything for a living, I would not be a writer. If I could do anything for a living, and this is very true, I would play lead guitar for Guns N' Roses. Like, that would just be the coolest thing. My wife and I got to see them this summer, and it was everything I dreamed it would be, by the way. But my second answer was, if I could do anything, what would I do? I would be a writer. And so I wrestled with that for about a day. And I actually didn't go to work the following day. I just stayed home and kind of thought about this. Like, should I do this? Should I not? Does this make me reckless or does it make me brave? All these weird questions. My wife came home from work that day. At the time, she was working for a photographer. And she walked in the house. And as she often does, she walked right into the bathroom, started washing her hands. And I leaned on the door jamb and with trembling voice said, "Kristen, I think I need to quit my job and become a writer." And it sounded so dumb coming out of my mouth. It's like, it sounds so right in your head. Then you say it and you're like, no. And so she looks at me, and that's a fragile moment for all of us, right? Like, when you really verbalize what you want to do, we're empowering the other people to crush this tiny little infant that we're handing them. And so I said it, and I was very frightened. And Kristen, who's such a remarkable woman, she looks at me and she just goes, "Yeah, I think that's right." And I was blown away, because she wasn't like, okay, like, we got to talk about, okay, like, mortgage. Like, she didn't use any of the words that would have crippled me. She just said, "Yeah, I think that's right." And so the next day I went into my job and I quit. I was like, I'm going to be a writer. And for the next, and I quit, and then a few weeks after I quit, that's when my dad died. Then a few weeks after him, my mom died. So obviously, even what I was envisioning was clearly tabled at that point. And this was no longer about art. For me, this was about just internal survival. I didn't write for a while, made a lot of really destructive decisions, in order to cope. But on the other side of that, I started writing and got rejected and rejected and rejected. And actually, rejections were great things, because I actually got a response. It was way harsher when it was just getting ignored, which is what it was the majority of the time. But I just kept going. I just kept going. And one of my favorite philosophers is Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says, if you have a good why, you will figure out the how. And for me, I was like, writing is it. I can figure the rest out. And so I just kept going. And I know this is like a very flawed lesson that I'm about to tell you, but it helps me. I think of it like this. I go, okay, let's say today there are 1,000 people that are setting out to become writers. By tomorrow, half of them will have quit. And so my odds on the first day are 1 in 1,000. My odds on the second day are 1 in 500. A month in, how many more people will have quit? By then, my odds are probably 1 in 50. And like I said, I know this is a very, very flawed lens through which to see it, but it's not totally untrue either. And so I just believed, I was like, I think if I keep going, this is going to happen. I had to get a second job for a while to make ends meet. The only job I could get was to teach sex education in Austin public high schools. It was a complete nightmare. It was just the worst. It's like, I'd go into classrooms and you're just like, good morning, children, and then you've got, 3 hours of notebook and PowerPoint slides. It was just horrific. It was like simultaneously insanely comedic, but at the same time, gut-wrenching and heartbreaking, because I would have 15-year-olds come up to me after class and go, I went and got tested after you came yesterday, and I found out I have this. What do I do? How do I get it cured? And then you're sitting there with this 15-year-old, and you're going, you can get treatment, but you don't get that cured. And so it was like this really, really potent experience. But part of what was so good about that for me was my willingness to do that affirmed to me that I really wanted to become a writer. Everybody wants to become an actor as long as they don't have to bust tables for 10 years. It's like, everybody wants to fall in love as long as they're not going to fight and be torn apart in the process. And for me, it's like I wanted to become a writer, but did I want to become a writer if I had to teach sex education 4 or 5 days a week for all that time? And for me, that I needed that confirmation. And so it was actually, I quit my job as a sex ed teacher, and I don't know, it was like a couple months later, my first book was published. And so I'm, this May for me, 10 years since I quit my job will be, I'm so proud of that, and so grateful because I've been so lucky. Like, I've worked hard, I know I've worked hard, but so have a lot of other people, and so I've been extraordinarily fortunate, and I don't like myself on the days when I take that for granted. So that's been a little bit of the, the stumbling journey along the way.
Morning.
Adam, right?
That's right. That's impressive you remembered. So my question to you is, when it comes to your writing, do you ever feel like people, they don't believe that you mean what you say, that you're over-embellishing or being dramatic, over-dramatic, or hyperbolic or whatever? And if you do, how do you deal with that?
Only someone who wrestles with things like that would ask that, and I love that about you. Sometimes it bothers me a lot. And then sometimes it doesn't bother me at all. And to me, there's a lot of philosophical questions that go into something like that, because there's a philosophy behind that of going, well, is the point to convey what happened, or is the point to convey how it felt? And those are two very different ambitions. Someone who's very close to me and that I work with a lot has taught me so much about art and writing. And one of the things, whenever I send him anything, he always asks me this question. He always says, what are you trying to do here? In this paragraph, in this page, this chapter, in this bigger piece. He says, what are you trying to do here? And the reason he asks me that is because he can only judge it and tell me if I'm accomplishing it once he knows what I've set out to do. And I say all that because a lot of times, someone might say, I don't believe you. I don't think that's the way it happened. And I could sit there and go, that's okay. My goal wasn't to tell you how it happened. That wasn't my ambition anyway. So you're judging me based on what you think I was supposed to try to accomplish, but that's not what I was trying to accomplish. And so for me, it becomes really important for me to know what is the gift of art or writing right now that I'm actually trying to offer. Because if I'm trying to offer facts and people don't believe me, that question bothers me. If I'm not trying to offer that and people ask me, it doesn't bother me at all. So to me, it becomes really, really critical that I have an understanding of my own ambition, not only so that I can achieve it, but so then I can gauge criticism fairly based on where I was trying to go.
I can just ask one now. My name's Tally. I had a question about just what are some ideas that you feel like you could write about forever? Like, what are some ideas that you're passionate about that you feel like need to be talked about?
Thank you, Tally. I'm so insecure with the things I write about that a lot of times, I think a lot of times I don't have the confidence not only to think that these matter to other people. I think sometimes I'm like, I don't even know if this should matter to me. And so I struggle a lot with that. But I care very, very deeply about people not being saddled with some need to pretend. That matters deeply, and I see that even when I'm not intending to communicate it. I see it kind of whispered in a lot of the things I write or talk about, or even in an interpersonal conversation. You know, like I just want people to be free from that. And I can trace that back, like a lot of things in my life. Like it is so classic, prototypical, addictive family that you are one thing in the house and you have to project something completely different outside the house. I mean, I remember being told, Josh, you cannot tell anyone that your dad is an alcoholic. Josh, you cannot tell anybody that, you know, your mom was married before. You can't tell anybody that. And so while it's like self-preserving in a way, it's so isolating. It's so isolating because then there are these parts that are kind of reverberating so loud in me that I'm not able to invite anybody else into. And so I still want that in my life, to be really connected to people, and I want that for other people, whether they want it or not. I want it for them. And so I see that kind of veiled in everything I do, and I would imagine that will probably never go away. I mean, they say it of filmmakers, I've heard it of writers too, even painters, that typically we're talking about the exact same things over and over and over. We're just painting it this time in a landscape instead of in a portrait, or this time the movie's set in the 1800s rather than modern day. But a lot of times we're exploring the same themes. Doesn't mean all of them are the same, but there are kind of a few like primary bones that are always present. And for me, I see that one's there. I want people, and not only people, but artists to be liberated. Like the cloud of shame under which we too often sit, I have found to be so poisonous in my life. I mean, shame is like the ultimate noose of joy. I mean, it creates loneliness. It creates such despair. It like completely devastates any sense of community and intimacy and connection, not only from other people, but from God, from ourselves. And so for me, because I struggle with that, it's like I want to help other people, but selfishly, I probably also want to know that I'm not the only one who's struggling with it. And so to talk about it then, it kind of invites other people to engage it with you, and you go, okay, like, at least I'm not the only one who hasn't figured this out. And so those are some of the things that I don't know, but I would guess that even if I wasn't intending to, they would probably show up in everything I do because they so strongly permeate me.
Hi. Okay, so I don't know if this will make sense, but I'm like really interested in hearing about your experience with being like creative and abstract, and maybe thinking like in more abstract ways in the middle of a faith whose church I feel like is very concrete typically, and like deals in more like black and white like rights and wrongs. yeah, I'm just wondering like how you have like found an intersection for like your faith and your art.
Yeah. Great question. And I don't think I have a very good answer, but I recognize what feels like a collision, a philosophical collision that typically, I mean, a lot of the language that we use in talking about like faith and Christian worldview, we use capital letter T. It's very objective. If art is going to be art, it has to be subjective. As you know, Christianity as a whole, a lot of times in my experience, and that doesn't mean this represents everyone by any means, but we have a major fear of being misunderstood. Art is supposed to give people the freedom to misunderstand it. That's the whole point. Like art is very democratic. It goes, hey, I've made this. Now we all participate in what it means. And it can mean something to you, and it can mean something to you, and it can mean something to you. But it's this invitation into a democracy where a lot of times that's not the way it feels in terms of the church. It feels a little more like a monarchy, and in maybe more, at the far end of the spectrum, more like a dictatorship. And so it does feel like a tension at times. But one of the things I have to remind myself is, and Jonathan and I, who you guys are going to get to hear from later, which is going to be amazing, by the way, but we were talking about this in regards to a different conversation. But I think sometimes I cave, and I think I create more problems by thinking that the objective voice and the subjective voice are in opposition to one another, when they're not. We're all contributing toward the same thing, but that only works when we see the value in the other voice. My wife and I went to this exhibit at the Met Museum in New York City last summer, and it was really amazing. It was all in fashion. And so the whole bottom floor, I don't know how many square feet it was, but it was all these designers who had made gowns from all over the world. And the exhibit was called Man versus Machine. And so half of the dresses were made on machine, and then half of them were all hand sewn. And so the question they're posing was, is one of these more important? Is one of these more valuable? And maybe at a deeper level, the whole exhibit is posing the question, are these enemies of one another? But the whole conclusion, what I loved about it so much, was that the conclusion of the exhibit was, they're not enemies. They are all together telling the story of fashion, and they're moving fashion forward. But that cannot happen at its optimal level unless they see each other as allies. I think there is a similarity between the subjective way that artists are wired to communicate and the way the world needs that conversation, and the objective conversation that a lot of times happens on like a Sunday morning, that as long as there's this like, you're against me, I'm against you, to me it's going to just create divisions that aren't necessary. But there has to be an understanding of why both matter. And to me, the great privilege as an artist is to be misunderstood. Like, how amazing is that? To just go, how great is this? It's not my job what you think about what I made. And so, I mean, Adam, even going back to what you said, I go, you can think I embellished it, that's okay. Because it's not my job to convince you that I didn't, or that I did. Like, that's not my job. That's not our job. As an artist, like, our job is to make something and then just let it go. And like, that's like the gift. Like, that's how we love people with our work. We invest ourselves into it, and then we go, now it's yours, and do with it what you want. And misunderstand it if you want to. But I too often get angry when I feel like that voice is getting sequestered or suffocated in a faith context that feels like a largely objective conversation. Like, I've been in numerous environments where someone comes up to me and they're like, I have a lot of problems with what you said. And my first instinct is to go, I'm a terrible person, I hate myself, spiral, rather than going, great. It's great. Because now there's a conversation. And that's so much of the value of art, it's democratic. It invites us into further conversation rather than going, I'm telling you how it is, now you don't have to talk about it. So I struggle with it, but for me, health is found in seeing the alliance between the two and not viewing it as a war.
Okay, guys, for the sake of time, we're going to have one more question. Hannah has a question. So I'm sorry if you didn't get to ask one, but we want to end because the next session starts at 10, so I want to give you guys a little bit of time. But we'll have one more.
Hi, I'm Hannah. Okay, so you tend to write about things that kind of like scrape at the bottom of the soul, I guess I would put it that way. And so I guess my question is, do you ever struggle with the tension between like sitting and writing about these really true things and writing with like a sense of appropriate vulnerability, or is that even a thing? And what does that look like for you?
I struggle with it. Yeah, I mean, to me, a lot of like, these things are all like kind of blurry lines. It's like appropriate vulnerability. Like I use that term too. I think I like, is this appropriate? But then I'm like, well, appropriate according to what? Or according to whose definition? Or according, because it's like I've sat in AA meetings and I go, like what we're doing in here is nothing like vulnerability in those environments, you know? And I see how transformative that is. I remember sitting in an AA meeting and this woman came in and we're all sitting in this circle. I was there supporting a friend who was getting her 1-year chip. So she had been sober for a year. And this other woman comes in and before she even sits down, I mean, she's just sobbing in front of all these strangers. And again, appropriate vulnerability, question mark? I don't know, not per a lot of context, right? And so she comes in, she's sobbing. The individual leading the meeting is like, yeah, you know, do you want to share? Do you want to tell us what's going on? She goes on to tell the story about how she had been sober for 7 years or something like that, long period of time. And that morning, she had seen her dad for the first time in a decade. And he was horrible to her. And she shared with us what he said. And I won't repeat it now because I'm afraid it's inappropriate, even though in that environment she shared it, and it was extraordinarily meaningful. And she's sobbing, and she's sobbing, and she's sobbing. She's like, and so after my dad said this thing to me, she's like, I went and bought a bottle of vodka, and I walked down the highway, and I drank the whole bottle until I passed out. It's heartbreaking. It's just like, oh my God, oh, like, you talk about like scraping the bottom of the soul, you know? And she goes, but I want to start again. So she gets up, she goes to the front, the individual leading the meeting gives her 1-day chip. Someone sitting next to me who's a total stranger, I've never met this person, he leans over to me and he goes, such a victory. And I'm kind of confused because in my stupid head, I'm like, dude, she totally freaking blew it. And I was like, what do you mean? And he goes, she's here. And I thought that, I was like, man, I want to, that sounds like Jesus. That sounds a whole lot like Jesus. And so it's not that I don't think that there is appropriate levels of vulnerability, but I think I long to be in a culture where we stop labeling whether someone's honesty is appropriate. And to me, the question I have to ask, and I don't know if I do it, I think sometimes I do it well, and I think sometimes I don't. But I think the question I have to ask is, by sharing this, am I giving people the chance to heal, or am I burdening them more? And while that question sounds all well and good, it's like, I have no idea what that means in this context. Like, I have no idea. Like, in what could be healing for some could be burdening to others. And so it's like, these are ambiguous questions to wrestle with, but like I said, I think I long for an environment where we stop going, you shouldn't say that. That's not appropriate. That's a little too. And I go, what are we doing? Like, what do we think relationships are? Like, my goodness. It's like, I find a certain agony in that. And I guess I savor being vulnerable in a way to some extent that at times makes people uncomfortable because I go, good. Maybe now we're maybe finally getting vulnerable once one of us starts to feel uncomfortable. Y'all, thanks for hanging out for a little while. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you guys. One more thing. Some of the questions about how art interacts with culture felt like really prevalent for the panel that Josh is going to be on actually in a little bit. So if you see on the schedule the arts and culture panel, Josh will be on that as well. So you'll have an opportunity to ask some more questions about that topic also later. So thank you guys.